Clint Eastwood, Hollywood's ultimate icon of grit and glory. For over 7 decades, he stood tall like an unshakable monument, redefining masculinity, justice, and resilience on the silver screen. From the good, the bad, and the ugly to Gran Torino, he wasn't just an actor. He was a symbol, a force, a legacy. Millions admired him. Billions knew his name. But almost no one knew the man behind the legend. And now at 95, the world's toughest cowboy faces a tragedy no role could prepare him for. A silent storm has swept through his final years. Loneliness, betrayal, fading memories, and the haunting loss of those he once loved most. Behind those sharp eyes lies a heartbreak deeper than any character he's ever played. What truly happened to Clint Eastwood in the shadows of fame? What secret is still locked inside the walls of his empty home? If you've ever known or admired Clint Eastwood, don't forget to hit the like button. Your small gesture is a powerful tribute to an extraordinary legendary talent. Before Clint Eastwood became Hollywood's last real cowboy, he was just a forgotten child of the Great Depression. Shivering in the back seat of a car, moving from town to town, never knowing where home would be next. Born in 1930 in the economic rubble of San Francisco, Clint entered the world with the weight of survival already pressing against his tiny frame. His birth was so dramatic, 11 pounds, one of the largest babies the hospital had ever seen, that nurses nicknamed him Samson. But there was no heroic beginning here. The Eastwood family was constantly uprooted, driven by the unstable jobs of his father, a steel worker whose employment came and went like the California wind. By the age of 10, Clint had already lived in over a dozen cities across the West Coast. These weren't just moves. They were displacements, moments of emotional dislocation that taught a young boy how quickly the ground beneath you could vanish. In a rare interview, Clint once admitted, "You learn not to get attached because nothing stays." Behind that quote lies a childhood marked by cold motel beds, awkward first days at unfamiliar schools, and an aching silence that would later become the bedrock of his on-screen stoicism. His mother, Ruth, was known for her strict discipline. His father, Clint Sr., was a passive figure, a man trying to hold on but slowly slipping into quiet resignation. That emotional imbalance forced young Clint to rely on himself, forging an independence that bordered on emotional isolation. Teachers labeled him a troublemaker. He was held back a grade and eventually expelled from Piedmont High School for carving obscene images into school property. The world saw a defiant boy, but inside was someone gasping for stability, control, and connection. "School never made sense to me," he recalled years later. But music, that was different. Clint taught himself to play piano at age 12, sitting for hours on end, fingers bleeding as he refused to stop until the keys stopped hurting. The piano became more than an instrument. It was a metaphor for his spirit, scarred, solitary, and relentless. Even then, he didn't dream of being famous. He dreamed of being heard. Imagine a teenage Clint practicing Gershwin alone in the garage, while other kids were out chasing dreams he couldn't afford to have. That's the real beginning. Not a movie set, but a cracked bench, a dusty keyboard, and a boy quietly building his armor. His youth wasn't shaped by mentors or applause. It was forged in rejection, transiency, and silence. By age 15, Clint had already internalized the harshest truths of life. Love was conditional, security was temporary, and if you didn't take care of yourself, no one would. These aren't just backstory details. They are the hidden tragedies behind the legend. The same pain that made him powerful also made him distant. It's heartbreaking to realize that the unshakable stare we later saw in Dirty Harry or Unforgiven wasn't a performance. It was a memory, a reflection of a childhood where a boy had to become his own protector far too soon. And that's what makes Clint Eastwood's rise so astonishing. Because out of all that loneliness, he didn't collapse, he climbed. And behind the legend we celebrate is a child we must never forget. Before Clint Eastwood ever stood behind a camera or held the gaze of millions as a legendary cowboy figure, he came face to face with a moment that tested his will. Cold, disorienting, and unforgettable. In 1951, at just 21 years old, long before the red carpets and Oscars, Eastwood was serving as a swimming instructor in the U.S. Army at Fort Ord, California. One seemingly routine weekend trip to Seattle ended in disaster when the military aircraft he boarded experienced sudden engine trouble and was forced to make an emergency water landing off the coast of Point Reyes. The crash thrust him into a life-or-death trial that no Hollywood scene could replicate. There were no safety vests, no clear path to rescue, just sheer instinct and determination. He swam for what some recall as 2 to 3 miles through freezing waves and powerful currents, his limbs growing heavy with fatigue and the cold cutting deeper with every stroke. Each breath was sharp, each moment stretched into a mental and physical battle against the elements. Yet he pressed on, fueled by something deeper than fear, a quiet refusal to give up. When Eastwood finally reached shore, soaked, exhausted, and shaking from the cold, the ordeal had only just begun to leave its mark. That night, etched in shadows and silence, became a turning point in his life. Years later, he would reflect softly. I realized how fast life could be taken away. I didn't want to waste a minute after that. It was more than a near escape. It was a personal awakening. From then on, Clint Eastwood wasn't simply a man. He became someone defined by resilience, driven not by ambition alone, but by a deep urgency to live fully with purpose. That unseen chapter powered his relentless discipline and work ethic. On set, he became known for wrapping films quickly, running lean productions with laser focus. To others, it looked like efficiency. To those who knew him, it was the quiet echo of a moment he could never quite forget. His friend and collaborator Fritz Maines once said, "That crash never left him." Clint never said much, but after that he carried time like a weapon. He was always chasing purpose. That experience also bled into the characters he created. Solitary men shaped by pain, guided by a personal code, never easily shaken. They weren't just performances. They were reflections. Each glance, each pause, each choice on screen was weighted with the memory of that cold, vast ocean and the boy who emerged from it forever changed. But perhaps the most poignant part of enduring such a moment is that its aftermath often goes unseen. The quiet need for control, the restless nights, the inner weight he carried, it all lingered not in headlines, but in silence. In rare interviews, Eastwood would offer cryptic insights like, "You learn that fear is temporary, regret is forever." And behind the rugged image was someone who had once felt powerless in the face of nature, who learned early how fragile life can be. Maybe that's why even at 95 he's still telling stories, not to chase applause, but to leave something behind. He isn't trying to prove anything. He's paying tribute to survival, to second chances, to the moment he staggered out of that freezing sea with a heart still beating and a new fire inside that's never gone out. Before Clint Eastwood became the man whose glare could silence a room and whose presence defined a genre, he was just another nameless face in a town that didn't care who you were. Hollywood in the early 1950s was a ruthless machine, and Clint, tall, soft-spoken, and with no formal acting background, was thrown into its gears without armor. He began with roles so minor his name didn't even appear in the credits. One casting director called him too stiff. Another dismissed him as too quiet. In a place that rewarded charm and social maneuvering, Clint Eastwood stood on the margins, awkward, reserved, and strangely disconnected. He wasn't the kind who smiled through auditions or played the Hollywood game, and that's exactly why he was ignored time and time again. But what the studios didn't see was that behind that silence was something rare, persistence that bordered on obsession. He studied, not in drama schools, but by watching. He absorbed. He waited. He learned how to hold still while everyone else tried to shine. His first break came not through a dream role, but through endurance. In 1959, after years of rejection, he was cast in Rawhide as Rowdy Yates, a character originally intended as a sidekick. But Clint's screen presence, his quiet intensity, his refusal to overact, started to eclipse even the show's lead. He didn't speak much, but he didn't have to. Viewers were drawn to the mystery in his silence. He wasn't polished, but he was real. It was the first time the world leaned in and paid attention. Still, true stardom didn't come until fate introduced him to Italian director Sergio Leone. Together, they built something that would redefine cinema itself. The Dollars Trilogy, A Fistful of Dollars for a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, turned Clint Eastwood into a global phenomenon. But what most don't know is that Clint almost turned down the role. The script had barely any dialogue. "Why would anyone care about a cowboy who doesn't speak?" he reportedly asked. But something about the silence felt familiar, almost autobiographical, he accepted, and the rest became legend. That nameless stranger, stoic, brutal, morally gray, wasn't just a character. It was Clint. He had finally found a way to speak through silence. And yet, despite the fame, despite the iconic status, a shadow followed him. In interviews over the years, Clint hinted at a truth few understood. "I've always felt like an outsider," he once admitted, "even when I was in the middle of everything. For all the millions who watched him, who admired him, very few really knew him. He kept his circle small, trusted even fewer, and often retreated from the noise of Hollywood. Behind the hardened exterior was a man who quietly carried the ache of loneliness. Always the observer, never quite the participant. Even at the height of his fame, surrounded by flashing cameras and fans, he often felt invisible. That paradox became the foundation of his on-screen characters. Lone men isolated by fate, feared and respected, but never truly known. They weren't performances, they were reflections. Clint Eastwood didn't become a star because of luck. He became a star because he refused to disappear. He endured, he watched, he waited. And when his moment came, he didn't raise his voice. He let the silence speak louder than anyone ever had. When Clint Eastwood finally stepped behind the camera, it wasn't to chase accolades. It was to reclaim control over a life and career that had so often made him feel powerless. By the early 1970s, despite becoming a global star, Clint was growing weary of being the face others shaped. Studio executives clipped his instincts, directors micromanaged his every move, and scripts tried to cage him within the very persona that made him famous. Directing wasn't ambition, it was escape. "I just didn't want someone telling me how to feel anymore," he once confessed in a rare interview. His first major attempt, Play Misty for Me, 1971, was far from safe, a dark psychological thriller about obsession and loss, mirroring his own battle with emotional chaos. It was raw, unfiltered, and deeply personal. And though critics didn't fully grasp it then, it was the beginning of Clint Eastwood's true voice. That voice reached its thunderous peak with Unforgiven in 1992, a haunting Western that stripped away glory and left only regret, violence, and broken men. He won Best Director and Best Picture at the Oscars. But those golden statues weren't the victory. The victory was being heard finally without filters. Then came Million Dollar Baby 2004, a quiet hurricane of grief and loyalty. As the aging boxing trainer Frankie Dunn, Clint poured every ounce of his own guilt and guarded tenderness into the role. He didn't just play the character. He exorcised decades of buried pain when he whispers, "I got nothing," in the film's final act. It was more than a line. It was a lifetime speaking. Gran Torino 2008 followed, giving audiences a last look at the Eastwood archetype, hardened, grizzled, full of quiet fury. But this time, redemption crept in like a fragile light through a cracked door. In each of his films, Eastwood created characters who bled silently, carried guilt like skin, and stood tall not because they were strong, but because they had no other choice. These weren't fictional heroes. They were fragments of himself. Behind the lens, Clint wasn't just telling stories. He was confessing. He chose scripts filled with scarred men because he knew their language. He could see through the smile of a man pretending not to hurt. "I don't like neat endings," he once said, "because life isn't neat." That philosophy colored every frame he directed, unpolished, restrained, and achingly real. Yet for all his brilliance behind the camera, the process was lonely. Clint often worked in near silence, issuing direction with nods or single words. Crew members described him as distant, sometimes unreadable, but those who knew him best understood. This was a man speaking through images because real words had failed him too many times before. Even his closest collaborators, producers, actors, editors, often admitted they didn't truly know him. He kept his demons locked away, letting them slip only through the stories he told. And still, he kept going. In his 80s and 90s, when others had long retired, Clint continued to direct, not for fame, but perhaps to stay just one step ahead of the silence. His most recent projects, like The Mule and Cry Macho, show a man grappling openly with age, regret, and the ghosts that never leave. Because in the end, the camera became his mirror, reflecting the pain, the perseverance, and the impossible hope of a man who never stopped trying to make sense of his own scars. For a man admired by millions, Clint Eastwood's most haunting truth was this: he could never hold on to the ones he loved. In 1953, at the age of 23, Eastwood married Maggie Johnson, a beautiful, intelligent woman who believed in him when Hollywood didn't. They met on a blind date when he was still a struggling nobody, working odd jobs and auditioning for roles that barely had names. For Maggie, it was love. For Clint, it was a lifeline. He once said quietly, "She was steady when I wasn't." At a time when Eastwood didn't know what the future held, Maggie gave him something rare: faith. She stood by him through the lean years, through rejection, doubt, and the slow, grinding climb toward recognition. But success is a strange storm. When Rawhiding hit the airwaves and Clint became a household name, fame didn't bring them closer. It pushed them apart. Behind the cameras, his life spiraled into a routine of long shoots, long absences, and longer silences. Maggie waited loyally, raising their two children: Kyle, born in 1968, who would go on to become a jazz musician, and Allison, born in 1972, who would follow her father into acting and directing. She raised them mostly alone in a home that slowly grew quieter, not from peace, but from absence. Meanwhile, Clint drifted deeper into the world of late-night sets and secret phone calls. Extramarital affairs followed, not once, but over and over again. The man who once said, "I didn't want to be tied down," found himself emotionally unmet, adrift in a sea of admiration, but lacking genuine connection. Being known, he once confessed, doesn't mean being understood. Maggie tried. She forgave. She endured the headlines, the whispers, the sudden pregnancies that weren't hers. As the years passed, more children appeared. Children born to other women in other homes with other names. At least 6 more would be linked to Clint. Kimber, Scott, Catherine, Francesca, Morgan, and Lori. Some acknowledged, some hidden, one even given away in adoption. For a while, Maggie held on for Kyle, for Allison, for the man she once knew. But by the late 70s, it was clear the Clint she married was gone. The distance between them had become permanent, carved by betrayal and years of emotional neglect. They separated quietly, as if even the end of their story deserved discretion. When they divorced in 1984 after 3 decades of marriage, it wasn't scandal, it was sorrow. No screaming, no scenes, just a woman who had loved too much and a man who couldn't love enough. The settlement was large, 25 to 30 million, a staggering sum at the time. But no amount of money could mend the fragments of trust, the moments lost, or the growing chasm of regret. In private, Clint rarely spoke of the marriage, but in his work the grief bled through. His characters became more solitary, more burdened, more broken. Films like Tightrope and Unforgiven weren't just performances. They were confessions. Beneath the stoicism, there was a man quietly mourning what he'd lost, not by accident, but by choice. In a rare moment of honesty, years later, he admitted, "I was always moving forward, but sometimes I wonder what I left behind." In Maggie, he didn't just lose a wife. He lost the last version of himself who believed that love might be simple or safe. And after that, for Clint Eastwood, love would never be either. But if Maggie Johnson was the woman who stood by Clint Eastwood in his climb, then Sandra Lockett was the woman who met him at the peak and watched him fall. She wasn't just another lover. Sandra Lockett was the fire Clint Eastwood couldn't tame and the wound he never healed. When they met in 1972 on the set of The Outlaw Josie Wales, it wasn't just chemistry. It was a collision of souls, intense and irreversible. At the time, Clint was still married to Maggie, raising their 2 children, Kyle and Allison, while also navigating the hidden responsibilities of at least 3 other children, Kimber, Scott, and Catherine, from previous affairs. Sandra, too, was in a platonic marriage, but that didn't stop them. For the next 14 years, they were inseparable on screen and off, partners in passion and pain. To the outside world, they seemed like a golden duo of Hollywood romance. But behind the cameras, the love story unraveled into something darker, more volatile, more tragic. Sandra once said, "He was the love of my life, but also the most painful chapter of it." What began as electric soon turned possessive. Clint reportedly kept control of many aspects of her life, from the roles she could take to the choices she made behind closed doors. Their relationship, once thrilling, became suffocating. And when she underwent 2 abortions, reportedly under Clint's insistence, it etched a level of heartbreak she would never recover from. She longed for children, stability, a future. Instead, she got silence, distance, and betrayal. By the late 1980s, it all came crashing down. Clint had secretly moved another woman, actress Frances Pfizer, with whom he would later have daughter Francesca, into the home he once shared with Sandra. When she found out, it shattered her. She packed up the emotional wreckage and took it to court, filing a lawsuit against him, not only for palimony, but for fraud and career sabotage. She claimed he used his influence to block her from working, erasing her from the industry she once shined in. Though Clint settled out of court, the damage was already done. This wasn't just a breakup. It was emotional warfare, the slow death of a love that had once burned too brightly. And yet, through all the legal battles, through all the bitterness, Sandra never truly stopped loving him. In one of her last interviews before her death in 2018, she said quietly, "I kept waiting for him to say he was sorry, but the apology never came." And when she died of cancer, Clint didn't make a public statement. No flowers, no final words, just a haunting silence, perhaps louder than any eulogy. Those close to Clint say he was never the same after her passing, that somewhere beneath his composed exterior, a piece of him died with her. Perhaps because deep down he knew there would be no second chance, no reconciliation, no forgiveness, only regret. A man who built his life crafting legends of strength and resilience had finally faced a loss too raw to confront. And in that silence, the tragedy of Sandra Locke became his own. A love he destroyed, a guilt he buried, and a memory that time could never wash away. When Sandra Locke died in 2018, Clint Eastwood said nothing, no statement, no tribute, no flowers sent to the service. And yet those who truly knew him say his silence was not indifference, but devastation. After 14 years of love, rage, lawsuits, and heartbreak, her passing wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the end of any chance for closure. For a man who built his legacy on quiet strength, this was a silence that screamed. At 88 years old, Clint had outlived many of the people who once mattered most to him. But losing Sandra was different. She wasn't just someone he had loved. She was someone who had witnessed the most complicated parts of him. Someone who had seen him raw, unguarded, furious, vulnerable. And now she was gone, taking with her the last opportunity to reconcile the chaos they left unresolved. The woman he once tried to forget had now become unforgettable. Friends say he became more withdrawn after her death, more introspective. On the outside, he kept working, directing films like Richard Jewell and Cremaco, maintaining the image of a tireless legend. But on the inside, a part of him had frozen. In private, he would sometimes stare out into the distance after a long day on set, saying very little. His longtime producer once revealed, "There are ghosts Clint lives with now. Sandra is one of them." In the quiet corners of his caramel estate, the memories crept in. Her laughter echoing through old rooms, the smell of her favorite coffee blend, the piano she once leaned on while he composed. All mundane details, but together they formed a haunting symphony of regret. It wasn't that Clint wished things had gone differently between them. It was that he never got the chance to say so. Not in person, not with sincerity. He had spent decades building a wall between himself and the people he once hurt, perhaps to protect them, or perhaps to protect himself from guilt. But when Sandra passed, that wall collapsed under the weight of unspoken words. He once admitted in a rare private moment, "The hardest thing isn't losing someone, it's knowing you helped push them away." For all the Oscars, box office hits, and red carpets, Clint Eastwood now faced the most human of regrets. The ones we carry too long and speak of too late. Sandra Locke was never just another love. She was the mirror he didn't want to face and now would never get the chance to. And though the world may never see a statue or tribute in her name, Clint's eyes, when they wander, in the final act of his long-storied life, just when it seemed Clint Eastwood had finally found peace from decades of heartbreak and solitude, Christina Sandra entered quietly, not with red carpet flair, but with something far rarer, gentleness. They met in the early 2000s at his Mission Ranch Hotel in Carmel by the Sea, where she worked as a restaurant hostess. By 2014, she had moved into his home, bringing with her a calm, grounded presence. Unlike the chaos of past relationships, Christina offered him something he had never truly known: stability without conditions, affection without expectations. With her, he once said quietly, "I finally stopped chasing ghosts." For nearly a decade, Christina became the steady rhythm of Clint's final years. They shared quiet meals, long walks, evenings filled with music rather than memories. She didn't care for the fame or legacy. She cared for the man behind the myth. In a life filled with women who came and went, with children scattered across decades and states, Christina was the rare constant. And for a man who had always stood alone, she was the first to truly stand beside him. But on July 18th, 2024, the quiet came to a halt. Christina Sandera passed away at age 61 from cardiac arrhythmia with atherosclerotic coronary artery disease listed as a contributing factor. There were no headlines, no interviews, just a quiet loss that left Clint Eastwood devastated in a way no camera could ever capture. He did not speak publicly, save for a single line through a family spokesperson. Christina was a lovely, caring woman, and I will miss her very much. At 94, Eastwood was once again left behind. The man who had survived plane crashes, betrayal, scandal, and the relentless passing of time now found himself facing one last cruel silence. Neighbors noted the change, the drawn blinds, the still piano, the long pauses between sightings. The home once filled with quiet laughter now echoed only with memory. At Christina's small private service, Clint stood silently at the edge, dressed in black, unshaven, motionless. No tears, just eyes clouded with something deeper than grief. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. After the final prayer, he lingered, hand resting on her urn a moment longer than anyone else. And as the others walked away, he whispered something no one could hear. Later, his housekeeper found her favorite scarf still folded on his chair, untouched. Her reading glasses remained on the windowsill. Nothing had moved. Nothing had been put away. Christina had never asked for the spotlight. She had never worn the name wife, nor stood on red carpets beside him. But for Clint, she had become his final refuge. In her presence, he didn't have to be the icon, the director, or the tough cowboy. He could simply be a man growing old, finally loved, finally understood. Her passing wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of a sanctuary, a reminder that even in peace, life can be unbearably fragile. That for Clint Eastwood, love had always come with an expiration date, and this time, it left him utterly, quietly alone. Now in the silence of his empty home, when asked how he's doing, he simply says, "Now it's quiet again." Over the decades, he built legacies on screen. Men who fought for justice, who protected the innocent, who faced death with calm resolve. But in real life, when it came to fatherhood, his silence often spoke louder than his presence. He is known to have fathered at least 8 children with 6 different women, though for years he refused to publicly confirm the exact number. Some children didn't even know he was their father until they were adults. Some were kept secret from the world and perhaps even from Clint himself. Among them was Lori Murray, born in the 1950s and adopted by another family. She only discovered her true paternity decades later in a revelation that stunned even Hollywood insiders. One close family friend said it was as if part of his past walked back into the room quietly, respectfully, but undeniably. Then there was Kimber Eastwood, born in 1964 from his long affair with Roxanne Tunis, while Clint was still married to Maggie Johnson, followed by Kyle, 1968, and Allison, 1972. The children from his official marriage to Maggie. Years later came Scott Eastwood, born in 1986 to flight attendant Jocelyn Reeves, now a successful actor himself, and perhaps the most public of Clint's children. His sharp jawline and piercing eyes echo a younger Clint so strongly, some fans call him Eastwood reborn. But resemblance doesn't always mean closeness. He didn't make it easy, Scott once said in an interview, choosing his words carefully. He made you earn it. Other children include Catherine, Francesca, and Morgan, each from different relationships, different fragments of a life lived in constant motion. In all, Clint's children form a mosaic of timelines and emotional distances, each loved in their own way, but rarely with consistency. Birthdays were often missed, calls unreturned, apologies unspoken. He wasn't cruel, one insider shared, just distant, always somewhere else. To the public, Clint was stoic and wise. To many of his children, he was a mystery. He rarely discussed them in interviews, and when he did, it was often vague, carefully measured. The man who made a career of playing fathers on screen, men who taught lessons, who fought for their children, struggled to show that tenderness in real life. Perhaps he didn't know how. Or perhaps beneath all the armor, he feared it. Now in his mid-90s, Clint is occasionally seen at quiet family gatherings, often seated a little apart, watching more than engaging. Photos surface now and then, he and Scott at a premiere, he and Allison at a fundraiser. But there's a stillness in his posture, a look in his eyes that suggests he's not quite present, as if still trying to catch up with the years he lost. And the children, though grown, though successful, carry their own shadows. Some are close to him, others distant still. None of them speak with bitterness, but in interviews, the words they choose, complicated, private, independent, tell a quiet story of absence. Clint once said, "You can only be young once, but you can be immature forever." It was meant as a joke, but maybe in some way it was a confession. He gave the world unforgettable characters, but to the people who shared his name, what he withheld speaks louder than what he gave. No grand apologies, no sweeping reconciliations, just quiet gestures, an invitation here, a brief phone call there, a nod of recognition in a crowd. At the end of it all, for Clint Eastwood, fatherhood wasn't a role he performed. It was a wound he never quite knew how to heal. Clint Eastwood is now 95. He continues to anchor his days in the coastal hush of Carmel by the Sea, primarily at the Mission Ranch, a beloved estate he restored and opened to guests in the mid-1980s. Nearby, his Tahama Golf Club, spread over pristine acreage, stands as more than real estate. It is his testament to calm, a pledge to preserve unspoiled nature, and refuge from the noise of celebrity. And yet, for all the silence Clint Eastwood has surrounded himself with in these twilight years, the past still echoes softly but relentlessly. Every corner of Mission Ranch holds a memory, and not all of them are kind. He walks past the piano Christina used to play, now untouched. The chair where she read, now always empty. Her absence isn't loud, it's a whisper, a stillness that follows him room to room. And with it comes shadows from farther back. Maggie's quiet goodbye, Sandra's bitterness that never found peace, children he knows only through headlines or holiday photos. These aren't just ghosts of people, they're ghosts of choices, regrets, missed chances. At 95, he doesn't run from them, but he doesn't speak of them either. Those who visit say he stares long at the ocean these days, as if watching something or someone he let drift too far to call back. Time doesn't heal, he once muttered under his breath. It just hardens. There is no script for grief this slow, no retake for moments he let slip away. And so, even in the golden light of a California afternoon, Clint Eastwood often seems like a man still walking through storms that never quite passed. In these grounds where sheep wander under golden skies, Clint has found his final sanctuary. His daily rituals remain disciplined, a gentle round of golf, strength training adapted for his age, walks along Mission Ranch's gardens, and twice daily meditation, a practice he began in his 50s. Though frail decades ago, his body now looks lean and weathered, but still steady. His dietary philosophy is unchanged from when he first embraced it in the late 1950s. Lean and green meals most of the week. Light fish or chicken, hearty vegetables, almost none of the sugar or red meat he witnessed. Take his father in 1970. Even at 95, Clint often quips, "There's no reason why a man can't improve with age." Professionally, he shows no signs of stepping away. Juror 2 premiered in 2024 and was widely assumed to be his swan song. Yet in private conversations, Clint reaffirmed that he is already in pre-production of a new original film. His creative energy remains evident in the few interviews he grants. "I'll work as long as I'm still learning or until I'm truly senile." This decided will anchored in decades of disciplined film arises not from vanity, but from endurance. For all his legacy, Clint now lives largely alone. His longtime partner, Christina Sandra, passed away in July 2024, leaving behind no public tributes, just the silence of their shared life. His children, Kyle, Allison, Scott, Francesca, Morgan, as well as others known and quietly acknowledged, remain scattered both emotionally and geographically. Occasionally, he joins family gatherings. Photos emerge of him at his daughter Morgan's wedding at Mission Ranch, or subtly beside Scott at a Hollywood premiere. But observers note a distance, present in frame, yet not fully there. Those familiar with him describe quiet cordiality with his adult children, but not closeness. Some have built their own families. Others maintain only faint patterns of recognition. Health-wise, reports confirm occasional fatigue and reduced mobility, but no major illness has been revealed. He avoids travel except by private car, choosing instead to stay at Mission Ranch, sometimes tending to the gardens or sitting by the piano that once prompted Christina's laughter. He remains alert, but the fire of his younger years gives way to stillness. He has not announced any formal estate plan, though his real estate legacy speaks volumes. The Mission Ranch in Tehama Golf Club, a Spanish-style bear mansion, the Rising River Ranch in Northern California, Sun Valley and Maui Beach properties. These holdings reflect his creed, not opulence, but preservation. Each place is a memory, a poem in bricks and fields, a fixture intended to outlast him. In interviews, he has said little about inheritance. His priority, he implied, is the enduring value of these places, not their distribution. Clint's outer face today shows time spared no mercy. Weathered skin, thinning gray hair, eyes often clouded yet sharp with retained dignity. He no longer seeks public attention. Instead, he views the world in muted segments. If fans catch a glimpse on foot or at a small event, they report a brief nod or faint smile. Legend now moves with economy, but inside the unspoken echoes remain. The children with whom he had distance, the women who loved him and eventually vanished, the silence around Christina's death. These memories are a quiet weight in private. He once reflected, "The hardest thing isn't losing someone, it's knowing you helped push them away." That inner confession now resonates in the long cycles of his solitude. Each afternoon, he can be found on the porch of Mission Ranch, script in hand or a tennis racket resting at his side. He may or may not direct again, but he still rehearses silently. His is not a life of finality, but of reimagined legacy. Wisdom carved in resilience, not applause. This his final chapter is not capped by fame, but by quiet persistence, not framed in drama, but in memory. Clint Eastwood remains an unassuming philosopher of solitude and survival, a man who built myth but now dwells softly in its shadows. He was never perfect, and perhaps that's why he mattered so much. Clint Eastwood was never the flawless hero. Not on screen, not in life. He stumbled, he hurt others. He carried wounds he didn't know how to heal and offered love he sometimes couldn't hold on to. But in all his contradictions, he remained true to one thing: authenticity. He stood for quiet strength in a world addicted to noise. He showed us that courage doesn't always roar. It sometimes just endures. That a man can be broken and still be strong, can be alone and still stand tall. Over the decades, his films gave voice to the forgotten, dignity to the flawed, and beauty to silence. He shaped more than cinema. He shaped how generations understood resilience, regret, redemption. And maybe that's the most honest legacy of all. Not the awards, not the box office, but the unspoken truth he lived. Even legends are human. If Clint Eastwood's journey touched you in any way through a film, a moment, or simply his quiet defiance against time, share your thoughts below. Your voice is part of the tribute to a man who spent his life telling stories, so the rest of us could feel less alone.